Hello guys, welcome back again to my channel. The name remains Dr. Brown. I hope you're doing well, and I hope you did enjoy my previous videos. Today I'm looking forward to discussing with you the visual pathway. Okay, this is a pretty somewhat tricky pathway, but my goal is to try to break it down and make it as simple so you can always recall. And basically, what we are trying to do is basically know the various defects that can occur along the visual pathway and the particular area that the defect is occurring. So let's jump right into it. So in the visual pathway, we have the left visual field and the right visual field. Okay, this is related to the nose. The part closer to the nose is known as the nasal visual field, and then the part outside or lateral to the nose is the temporal visual field. Okay, basically, the name is coming from the location. Okay, so the visual pathway, the visual field closer to the nose or in the middle or medial is the nasal visual field, and then the part on the lateral, closer to the temporal bone, is a temporal visual field. Okay, so we need to know this. Okay, this is very key. So once we know that, then we have a fair idea of what's happening and how best to expand the rest of the visual pathway. Okay, so one other key thing to remember is that whatever is represented on the visual field, okay, is also represented on the retina. Okay, and then from the retina is going to be carried by the optic nerve, and then it will go down all the way to the primary visual cortex located in the occipital lobe. Okay, but the key thing I want you to remember here is that whatever is seen on the visual field is represented in an inverted proportion on the retina. Okay, so basically what I mean by this is that the temporal part of the visual field would become the nasal part of the retina and vice versa. Okay, and then the nasal part of the visual field would become the temporal part of the retina. Okay, so this is very, very key. Okay, so unlike the direct representation, the nasal part of the retina would be the temporal part of the visual field. Okay, and then the temporal part of the retina would be the nasal part of the visual field. It's just, just have that in the mind, of your mind, that whatever you see on the visual field is going to be an inverted proportion or inverted image on the retina. Okay, so from the retina, you can see in the middle we have the optic chiasm. Okay, now the optic chiasm, you can see that at that point there's a crossover. Okay, now what crosses over is the nasal part of the retina. Okay, so the nasal part of the retina will cross over at the optic chiasm. Okay, so this is very key because when we start talking about the defects, then you are going to know how it will manifest on the visual pathway. So the nasal portion of the retina would cross over. So this tells you that would be the defect will be seen on the temporal visual field. Okay, because if you look at the diagram, the optic chiasm is in the middle. Okay, and in the middle, that is where the nasal part of the retina crosses over. And like we said, the nasal part of the retina is the temporal part of the visual field. So if there's a defect along that side, it will be manifested in the temporal visual field. Okay, now the retina is connected to the optic chiasm by the optic nerve. Okay, so we have the right and then the left. Then after the optic chiasm, the pathway continues to the optic tract, and then from the optic tract you get to the lateral geniculate body. Okay, and then from the lateral geniculate body we move on to the optic radiations. Okay, now the optic radiations, there are two components. Okay, So you know that we have various components of the brain. Okay, the brain has like various different lobes. So it's key to note that. Okay, so the optic radiations is going to have two components. First, it will have the parietal component, which will be found along the parietal lobe, and then it will have the occipital component as well, which would be along the occipital lobe. Okay, so that we have the parietal lobe component of the optic radiation, and then the temporal lobe component. And then lastly, like I said, the visual pathway starts from the visual field and ends in the occipital lobe, which houses the primary visual cortex. Okay. So basically, we've just gone through the various components of the visual pathway. Okay. We'll shortly now just delve into what happens, the type of defect that you get, and if you are experiencing a particular defect, it means which part of the visual pathway is being affected. Okay, so we need to know that. It's quite, that's the essence of this whole visual pathway. Okay, what type of defect is this, and based on the type of defect, where in the visual pathway is affected. So the first defect we'll look at is complete loss of vision, for example in the right eye. Okay, so this is always most likely an ipsilateral cause, so can be seen as monocular loss of vision. So if you lose vision in your right eye, most likely the defect is along the retina or the optic nerve. So if it's the right eye, because I said it's lateral, it means that there's a defect in the right side of the retina or the right side of the optic nerve. Okay, so in the visual field, you see that the dark area means that that's where like no vision. Okay, that's why it's painted dark. So then we have the bitemporal hemianopia, okay, which is the second one. So you see that the dark area is on the outside, which is the temporal part of the visual field, meaning that the nasal part of the retina is what is affected, okay, because the optic chiasm houses the nasal component of the retina, which is the temporal part of the visual field. The third one, we call it the homonymous hemianopia. Okay, this type of defect is seen when the defect is at the optic tract or the lateral geniculate body. Then you see the third one, which is the homonymous hemianopia. Okay, now we have from that we move on to the quadrantopia. So we have the superior and we have the inferior. Okay, so when you're seeing the defect at the superior, okay, as the diagram shows, it means that the defect is at the optic radiations, but there are two components. So the defect is actually at the temporal lobe. Okay, so I always try to remember that. Okay, you get to the parietal lobe before you get the temporal lobe, but in quadrantopia, the upper part is the opposite. So superior quadrantopia homonymous will be the temporal lobe or the temporal portion of the optic radiation, and then the inferior would be the parietal lobe. Okay, don't forget that. Very, very important as well. Okay, so number 6, also again, homonymous hemianopia. Just repeated it here so that you have a fair idea that there are two along the visual pathway. When there's damage to two components, either the optic tract or the lateral geniculate body, you would get a homonymous hemianopia. And last but not the least, homonymous hemianopia with macular sparing. That is a defect in the primary visual cortex, that is the occipital lobe, and there's macular sparing because the macula is being supplied by the middle cerebral artery, which will not be affected by the visual pathway. So that's why it's going to spare that aspect. Okay, so the macular sparing actually differentiates the visual cortex defect from the homonymous hemianopia, which you get from the optic tract and lateral geniculate body. Okay, so I'll just try to make the video short, but I think it's a bit long. But I hope I have been able to simplify this video enough for you. Just go through it and try to understand the various components. And I'll see you some other time. Do not forget to like, share, comment, subscribe. Thank you for watching.